what we're looking for in gun news in 2026, plus a federal appeals court strikes down California's open carry ban. All this and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogelman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. The Reload.com, of course, is where you can head on over today to sign up for our free weekly newsletter. It'll keep you up to date on all things happening in the world of gun politics and policy. Before we jump into those news stories, though, we probably should update our viewers and listeners that you are not in your usual studio setup. In fact, you're not even in the United States right now. Is that right?
That is correct. I'm in a basement in Switzerland. I have not been taken or anything like that.
Yeah, he's not on the lam.
Yes, I'm not running from the law quite yet. Maybe after this episode, we'll see how spicy things get here. But we'll see if they let me back in to the country. But no, I'm on my honeymoon, which started in Paris, actually, which was fantastic with my lovely new wife. And then we actually are in Switzerland to attend my sister-in-law's wedding as well. So, and to, see the sights. We went to the Alps and saw that. It's been a really lovely trip so far. I have tried to stay relatively abreast of what's going on in the US, which, has been a lot. A lot of things have happened. Certainly, even just the last 24 hours has been quite a lot of news. Some of it's at least tangentially related to our beat here, covering gun policy and politics. But yeah, so that's why, if you're wondering, this might sound a little different than normal and look a little different than normal. But we are going to do our best to bring you the news update. It's been 2 weeks since we did this show. It's the beginning of the new year. We're not actually going to have an interview podcast this week because I'll be at the wedding the time that I would normally film that. So I'm just I want to, keep the podcast content flowing here. We did do the interview podcast the 2 weeks we didn't do news update, and this week we're going to do the news update instead of the interview podcast, and then hopefully next week things will be back to normal. But we're just doing our best to keep you guys updated, keep you in the know, and having a good understanding of policy and politics surrounding firearms in the United States. And so, speaking of which, I guess we can start off right with my kind of look ahead piece that I did for members last week's members newsletter, which goes out every Sunday for those of you who are not members and would like to sign up. That is, get an extra newsletter that goes out on Sundays. So some of the Reload members who will have some understanding of this already, but I tried to look a little bit ahead at what we're going to be watching for when it comes to the new year, 2026 here. All the most important stories of the new year. Starting off, I think, with we can start with gun law, right? Because that's something that we've ended up, since Bruen, that's really dominated gun news, I would say, in the United States. Obviously, it's not the only topic that we covered, but it is one of the biggest. And this new year brings the potential for some pretty massive bits of news in the legal world, the legal world of gun policy, because the Supreme Court is going to decide 2 different cases already that are actual Second Amendment cases. And this is something that's key, right? Because we've talked about a lot of Supreme Court cases the last couple of years, but most of them, while gun related, for instance, last year there was the Mexico lawsuit against the gun industry, or there was the NRA had its First Amendment lawsuit against a former New York financial regulator, Vulu. And those were significant cases. They were gun related in the sense that it's the gun industry and the largest gun rights group being involved in them, but neither one were actually Second Amendment cases and did not end up adding to Second Amendment jurisprudence. Whereas these two cases, which involve one, Hawaii's vampire rule, their concealed carry regulations post Bruin, and two, the marijuana or drug user in possession federal prohibition, which in that case is focused primarily around the defendant's marijuana use, although there's a lot of other things that he's also accused of by the Department of Justice, but the actual charges revolve around his habitual use of marijuana. And so, I don't know, those might seem like smaller disputes than like the gun industry case, which could have gone, in theory, could have shut down the American gun industry as we know it. It's one sort of potential outcome, and certainly that's what the industry argued. These cases could be, smaller things, but the fact that they are Second Amendment challenges to these laws that the Supreme Court is going to hear and rule on makes them much more substantial, I think. Right? What do you think, Jake?
Yeah, I say even if the narrow challenges themselves maybe aren't the sexiest issues in the world for if you're like a gun rights advocate, or, for instance, who's been wanting them to take some other issues, just because there's so few Second Amendment cases that come out of the Supreme Court, literally anything that they decide and rule on and write about has the potential, at least, to reshape gun policy as we know it. Obviously, the Rahimi decision didn't do, in effect, didn't change a whole lot, but it, depends on how courts interpret what they write, because every little thing that they do write does matter, and it does have knock-on effects down the line, as we see the litany of cases that we cover so often here on the Reload that go down through the lower courts. So absolutely, it could have a serious impact, especially if I think a lot of people will be watching to see what they do in the immediate aftermath of their decision, whether or not they decide, okay, we've decided some more carry stuff, some prohibited person stuff. Now we need to take up more cases, or they could say, like they do in other cases, now it's time to vacate all of the pending challenges, and we think lower courts, you need to reconsider those now in light of our new decisions. And so that itself is its own sort of meta story surrounding these two particular cases.
Yeah, that's very true, because after Rahimi, they did that, and it basically just kind of reset a lot of these cases, even though and really the outcome in most of them didn't change. Although there were occasions where judges changed their view of the Second Amendment and how to properly interpret it after Rahimi. So, but yes, the court has been, it is interesting to discuss, to think about, right, and to analyze here, because certainly gun rights activists believe the court has been way too slow on these questions, these major questions that remain unresolved about the Second Amendment, like whether assault weapons bans are constitutional. But, they have been taking Second Amendment cases at a higher rate than they used to. And that's in the context of a court that isn't as busy as it used to be. Different Supreme Courts in the past have taken a lot more cases than the Roberts Court. The Roberts Court has been a bit more slower and methodical in how they pick cases, at the very least, cases on the merits, right? Most of the controversy around the Supreme Court has come in recent months around their emergency docket and, the rocket docket, whatever you want to call it, where they're not deciding the merits of a case necessarily, or at least not literally, right? And there is, I think, a fair perception that however something gets decided in the emergency docket is likely to be the way it's going to come out on the merits as well. But it is a different track. And so for the merits track, the traditional, they go and hear a full case and issue a full opinion with everybody's, where everybody writes something or joins, something else. That has moved pretty slowly on the Roberts Court. And so it's interesting to see them taking up several more Second Amendment cases this year. And there's still potential that you could get more than just these two as well. But that does say something. In court time, they're moving fairly aggressively on the Second Amendment. Now, you could certainly argue that they need to, right? Because it's the least developed, I would say, uh, of the rights of the amendments, except for maybe, I don't know, the Third Amendment, right? Like there's not a lot of Third Amendment case law, I suppose, but there's only a little bit more Second Amendment case law. And when you only have half a dozen cases to go off of for what the Supreme Court believes the Second Amendment means, any new case is going to have likely a significant impact throughout the federal courts. So that's the big ticket item in the law. That's not the only thing, though. Of course, there's quite a lot of other. We're not going to get into every single thing that I wrote in the members piece here, but there's quite a lot of other legal things to watch out for as well, like the Third Circuit, which is something you've written a lot about over the last year. The potential there to become kind of a circuit split generator, right? Yeah, that's something that we'll continue to watch as well. And perhaps you can explain a little bit of the significance of why that matters.
That's right. Yeah. Because of President Donald Trump obviously retaking the White House and having a Republican-controlled Senate, he's been able to appoint two new judges onto the Third Circuit that has sort of shifted the balance of power on that circuit. And you might wonder why is that significant? We've already had conservative-leaning circuits, but the Third Circuit is sort of uniquely situated in that is particularly because of New Jersey, I would say, being in the Third Circuit, just because New Jersey tends to be home to many of the most stringent gun control laws in existence. And so any challenges that originate against New Jersey's laws have to go through the Third Circuit as they make their way through the appeals process. And with a conservative appointed majority, you may start to see big rulings come out of there that strike down some of those strict gun laws, like you said, which could result in the circuit split that gun rights advocates have been looking for, which then could, in turn, potentially anyway, entice the Supreme Court to take up more of those cases like hardware ban challenges against AR-15s and the like. So some of the big ticket items that gun rights advocates really want the Supreme Court to be filling its time with. So,
right, because it solves one of the fundamental problems that gun rights activists have run into in federal courts, which is that as far as the strictest gun measures go, they tend to only be passed and enforced in places like California, Massachusetts, Hawaii, like the places that are deep blue. And the way the federal court system works, the appointments work, is that state senators or senators, not state senators, but senators from states that are overseen by each circuit have a say in who gets picked. There's a blue slip system. And that means in practice, oftentimes you will see the most liberal circuits are the ones governing the most liberal states, right? And the most conservative circuits are the ones governing the most conservative states. So the Fifth Circuit tends to have the reputation of being the most conservative federal circuit. And guess what? It's the circuit that governs Texas. The Ninth Circuit has the most, reputation for being the most liberal circuit. And guess what? It governs California. So, in part, there's other states in those circuits as well, but you get the concept here. And so it can be difficult for gun rights activists to win in those circuits. And since the only places that have the laws, they're the assault weapons bans, magazine limits, universal background checks, things of that nature, are harder to find in other circuits, you tend not to get circuit splits on these questions. You tend to have the more liberal courts have a tendency to uphold the more stringent gun restrictions. And so if they all uphold them, it's less likely that the Supreme Court gets involved in a case like that. They can, they have occasionally, but it's not as common because the Supreme Court's main role is to decide these disputes between the lower courts. That's its primary function. So if the Third Circuit does develop into a circuit that takes a more expansive view of the Second Amendment, then and starts to strike down some of these laws that places like New Jersey have, which tends to be a state that tends to have some of the strictest gun laws in the country, has a lot of these kind of policies I was just referring to, then yeah, as you said, could be fuel for the Supreme Court to take up even more Second Amendment cases. And then I think the last thing from the law perspective was DOJ and how DOJ acts through 2026, right? Because that's been a major story we've covered as well, is this sort of dichotomy that's evolved during the second Trump administration, where they have aggressively pursued some of these states that have the most onerous gun restrictions, even to the point of filing first of their kind actions, like in Washington, D.C., or the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, where they've gone after permitting, wait times in the case of LA, and the assault weapons ban in the case of DC. But at the same time, they've taken to defending nearly all federal gun laws. Now, we talked about this Cam Edwards, I think 2 weeks ago. There is a defense of that to say that the DOJ's job to a certain extent is to defend federal laws. But especially under this administration, they've been much less, they paid much less fidelity to that obligation. And so they've been much more willing to, not that they're the only administration who's ever done this, but they've been more willing to do it than others, to just not defend federal laws that they don't like or that they believe are unconstitutional, for instance. And so for whatever reason, though, they haven't taken that view in really any Second Amendment cases. They, like I said, they've gone out and filed on the side of gun rights activists in a lot of cases against certain state restrictions, including in this Hawaii case at the Supreme Court. Probably one of the reasons the Supreme Court took up this case is because the Solicitor General asked them to, even though they're not a party to the dispute. And so they've legitimately done a lot of pro-gun moves, and at the same time, and sometimes on the same day. This is what we talked about with the Knife Rights founder last week's interview podcast. The same day that they filed that DC assault weapons ban lawsuit, they also filed a brief defending the federal Switchblade Act, which is an act that bans or at least attempts to, we get into all the nuance of how that works, but they defended the idea that they could ban Switchblade sales. And so, and defended it with a lot of the same reasoning that you will commonly hear from governments who are defending their assault weapons bans. A lot of those very similar arguments. So there's a clear dichotomy that's developed in the administration, and specifically inside the Department of Justice, and that's something we're going to absolutely keep a close eye on to like understand where that's all headed, or if there will be any changes to it going forward.
Yeah, especially as it relates to the fallout with the gun rights groups, which we've talked about before, sort of the political story, which gets us into some of your political topics that we're going to watch for. Is just one, obviously the relationship with the gun rights groups and the Trump administration, but two, how that materializes heading into what's going to be a very closely watched election cycle. Obviously, 2026 is home to the 2026 midterms. Plenty to talk about in terms of the midterms. One, just how salient gun politics are going to be in an election. We've talked about, obviously, in the presidential election, guns didn't play that big of a role. Certainly not on the Republican side. President Trump almost intentionally minimized discussing guns and actively removed guns from the Republican Party's platform that year. But we've seen previous midterms, the 2022 cycle, guns did play a significant role. So that will be something to watch as well. Also be telling to see how involved the gun rights groups are, particularly the NRA, which obviously in past cycles has been the top dog in trying to make guns a political issue and mobilizing gun voters and endorsing candidates, but wasn't so much of a player in 2024 in light of its sort of beleaguered state. So those will definitely be things to watch this year in the politics realm.
Absolutely. And then, once the midterms are over, especially if they go the way they appear on the trajectory to end up, which is with Democrats retaking it at least one house, how gun politics shift after that. I mean, also there's so much, even beyond the Republican side, there's interesting stuff to watch out for on the Democratic side. Like, are some prominent Democrats, even some of the most prominent gun control advocates in the party, have suggested that one of the things they need to do to become more competitive in this midterm election is to accept more gun right, people who have different views on guns. That Senator Chris Murphy suggested that at one point. Excuse me. Back to the old podcast coughing. That's even in another continent, it doesn't go away. You get through it. There's been 20 minutes almost, and no coughing. So no, it's amazing, this profession. Anyway, Chris Murphy has suggested that perhaps Democrats need to be more open to accepting candidates that have differing views on gun politics. However, even though he is perhaps the most prominent Senate Democrat when it comes to gun policy, and he's a very staunch gun control advocate, like he wants much stricter gun laws. We haven't really seen much change practically on that front. I mean, maybe the only race that you've seen noticeably pro-gun-ish, or at least further to the right of most of the Democratic Party on the issue, is in the main Senate race, where you had the current governor, Janet Mills. Sorry. She opposed, for instance, the red flag law ballot initiative that, which is I don't even know how you read that one, because she opposed it, but it passed anyway. So how is she going to run on guns in the general if she's the nominee? And then I think the other, was it Grant? I forget his name, but there's a
Graham Plattner.
Yeah. He's sort of the upstart candidate until we found out that he has a Nazi tattoo on his chest. But he was also making taking different positions on guns than what you see from most Democratic candidates. I don't know if his candidacy is still viable after the Nazi tattoo scandal, but that's been the only race where I've really seen any significant variation. And I think, what is it, Jared Golden, the House rep, who was, again, like, there aren't really any, you don't really have any like A-rated Democrats left anymore. But Jared Golden is somebody who had sort of a mixed view on gun policy. It opposed some policies, but supported like assault weapons bans. But anyway, he retired. So I think he's like one of the only Democrats who's retiring. It's mostly Republicans right now because of how the polling is shaping up at this point. But yeah, so it'll be really interesting to watch how the Democratic Party shakes out, if anything changes. And then after, if nothing really changes significantly of how Democrats handle guns, the next most interesting thing I think will be how Donald Trump will react if Democrats retake one of the houses and they start to propose new gun restrictions, especially in the wake of a mass shooting, major mass shooting. Because we saw in his first term, pretty much every time there was a major mass shooting, Parkland, Las Vegas, El Paso, he responded by at least, if not openly considering new gun restrictions, like he did after Parkland, with having the whole roundtable meeting with Democrats at the White House. And then also he went forward and instituted new gun restrictions through executive action, right, through the ATF, in a similar way that Biden would copy later on multiple times, but with the bump stock ban, which was later found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. But does he revert to that if Democrats are in control? Obviously, I think the relationship between Donald Trump and the Democratic Party has deteriorated even further than it was during the first term. So, and I don't know if he's inclined to try to be the deal maker guy like he tried to be at points in the first term. So I don't know. I think that's an underrated possibility that Trump will do something like that. We'll try to craft some sort of gun regulation, but
to that point, he's continued the ideological flexibility. This isn't a gun issue, but you've made analogies in the past to how he's treated the pro-life movement in certain times for political expedience. And just this week, he made a statement addressing the House caucus saying that you need to be flexible on the Hyde Amendment when you're considering the upcoming funding bill, which is a new thing that he's doing. again, stiff arming the pro life movement in order to further some political end that he desires. And so, like you said, we very well could see something like that if he feels politically pressured to do something on guns. Once again, asking a core Republican constituent group to kind of take a backseat and let something go. So it's entirely possible. I think you're right.
I think it's definitely a speculation at this point because the incentives aren't there for him to do anything like this right now.
That's right.
And so that's something to watch for post-election. How well the Democrats do if they are in fact going to retake the House and maybe the Senate. The Senate's obviously a much more significant reach than the House, given the map of who's up this year. But until then, I wouldn't expect anything really. I don't think Republicans, even with Trump making statements pressuring them, I don't know that they would pass anything when they control both houses. But I think he could move some Republicans. So that's the thing about Donald Trump, is that I think he's even as he's in his second term, traditionally become a lame duck, and you've seen some splintering of the MAGA movement. But even now, I think he has more control over the Republican Party than he did at any point in his first term. And so if he wants something and Democrats are willing to go along with it and they have control of the House, especially more so than even the Senate, that's where you get the potential for something like this. So but that's kind of, it is down the line stuff. But I do think, it's a good point there about the pro-life movement, because I think it's very analogous how he treats them to how he treats the gun rights people. Because rhetorically, he's got to be one of the most pro-gun presidents ever. Policy-wise, it's more mixed. And I think, and he has shown a willingness to try to make a deal if he feels the need to do that. Whether or not he would still act that same way this time around, we don't know. But that's something to watch out for as far as politics goes. Are the Democrats going to change you're going to see any pro-gun Democrats running in this election? Have they made any strategy change on that front? Because the party's been moving to the left on the issue since the Obama administration, right? And whether they think they've overcorrected on that point, I don't know. We don't see any practical signs really yet of opening, but we're also not quite into the swing of the election cycle yet. So, and then if Democrats retake things as they seem on track to do, which could always change, the election's not till November. That's a lifetime in politics. But if they stay on track and Democrats retake the House, how does Donald Trump react to that next time there's guns are the focus, which pretty much only happens after major mass shootings, as we've discussed in the past.
Yeah, certainly. But beyond politics, just a few last little bits of things that we'll be watching for this year is just the ongoing situation with the gun industry. We've seen the sort of Trump slump 2.0 that we've talked so much about, where just month over month declines in gun sales for most of 2025. How does the industry navigate that as we go into 2026? Because, technically, we've tended to see at least elections sometimes juice gun sales numbers. Midterms, not quite as much as presidential elections, but nevertheless, if it does become a salient issue, you never know what could happen there. So that'll be one thing to watch. But we also have countervailing policy things that maybe might have an effect. The NFA tax cut from the One Big Beautiful Bill took effect officially this year, and we've already seen, at least preliminarily, it appears to be a rush in new sales on NFA items. Maybe that buffers some of the gun sales numbers going into the year. We'll see if that momentum continues. And then we have at least potentially a new permanent director of the ATF. Trump has nominated someone for that role, and we'll have to see how his relationship is with the gun industry and whether or not it's a positive one or an antagonistic one. By all accounts, we probably expect it to be a positive one since it is a Republican appointee, but you never know, and that will be something to watch going forward, I believe.
Yeah, Robert Cicada, the nominee, has, from what we can tell and how the industry has publicly reacted to this point, and also just discussing with sources inside the industry, they have a positive view of Cicada. I will apologize for probably pronouncing his name wrong, but he's been at the ATF for quite a while now, and so they have a history of working with him, and they seem to like him. So, excuse me again. So at the very least, from the industry's point of view, I think it's a nomination that they like and are probably going to, go to bat for. The gun rights groups, I think, have been less vocal about it at all, right? I mean, I don't think they're upset with it. I don't know that certainly it's difficult to argue that this pick is anything like, Biden picking Chipman straight out of Giffords. The gun control group is certainly nothing to that level of like trying to reward political allies with a political pick like Biden did. And I would say it's probably even less political than now Chipman failed, to be fair. So maybe you don't want to go that route because it didn't work for Biden, but so there may be some political strategy involved there of just it's not worth the juice isn't worth the squeeze on that. You're not going to get it anyway. Maybe, I don't know. I don't know. I don't have insight into how the White House made this pick exactly, but I would even say he's probably less political than the previous director, who was Stephen Dettelbach, who was a U.S. attorney, but he ran for Ohio attorney general as a Democrat and had taken public positions on things like supporting this weapons ban. Whereas Robert Cicada, I'm not aware of him having really any public positions on anything because he's mainly been, a law enforcement agent at the ATF the last 20 years or so. So this feels like a much more traditional sort of throwback professional law enforcement guy to run a law enforcement agency pick. And so there's even some potential that you could get bipartisan support. Obviously the environment in Washington, as I just discussed, like it's much harder now to get any sort of bipartisan support for anything. So I don't know. And maybe he could outlive the Trump administration as well, even if a Democrat took offices. So that might be another part of the calculation for the gun industry too. They'd rather have him than whoever the next administration might appoint, rather than trying to really push to get more of an activist in the role. I don't know, but and speaking of that, the other area that the administration has been a little bit at odds with both the industry and the gun rights movement is about the ATF and what to do with it, because the administration has proposed a couple of times here folding it in to either the FBI or the DEA, which is not something that anyone in the gun rights or gun industry want. Gun rights movement or the gun industry, as far as I can tell, there've been public opposition to that as well. So how does the Trump administration handle that? Congress doesn't seem interested in doing it, for one. You've had a number of Republicans speak out against it, so I don't think there's going to be any action on it this year, but it'd be interesting to see whether the administration continues to pursue that or not.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think that's everything for the 2026 look forward. There's a lot more in the piece, but we're not going to have time to cover absolutely all of it. And so we'll try to just run through some of this week's news, right? You've already got 2 pieces on the site, and I have a little bit more coming. We're obviously filming this day early because the wedding is tomorrow. So we don't have quite everything ready like we would normally do on Friday, but you do have a piece on the pretty significant and interesting ruling out of the Ninth Circuit. We just kind of talked about how traditionally that's been the more liberal circuit, but a panel there just ruled on open carry, and maybe a bit of a surprising outcome.
That's right. Yeah. So a 3-judge panel, divided decision, so 2-1 opinion, struck down California's essentially a de facto blanket ban on open carry, but by the letter of the law, the way California does it is if it's a county with more than 200,000 residents, open carry is not allowed. If it's less than 200,000 residents, in theory anyway, folks can go apply for a permit to be able to open carry. Whether or not that's how it works in practice was some dispute in this lawsuit. But regardless, the panel came down on the side of the gun rights advocate who challenged California's law and said that no, the country has a very robust tradition of allowing open carry. In fact, in many places, open carry was the only form of public carry that was tolerated or allowed. And California, therefore, has to proffer an analog to justify its modern restriction. And it's tough to do that when throughout the entire relevant time period, open carry was pretty much allowed everywhere. And so the majority came down on the side of saying, no, California, you may not restrict open carry today, because that is probably the most protected form of carry in our history and tradition.
Yeah, it's an interesting finding. And I think you're going to have a little bit more about it too, because the Supreme Court has discussed this a little bit. And they've kind of alluded to it. They've talked about how, because concealed carry was more common to see concealed carry banned throughout the nation's history, and open carry being the primary form. And then culturally, the country changed significantly from those early days to the modern era, and people began to prefer concealed carry over open carry in most situations. And the laws started to reflect that, starting really around the 1990s, right? That's when a lot of those concealed carry bans were eliminated through legislation, through legislative action rather than judicial action. But yeah, it does leave you with this interesting history of, like, back in the founding era, which is what the Supreme Court says is the most relevant period for doing the Bruin tests and figuring out the history and tradition of gun regulations, and whether they match the modern restrictions that are being challenged. That's when open carry was the default way of doing things, and there weren't, as you just laid out, there weren't really any bans on it. And so how could it be upheld under this Bruin standard? But the Supreme Court itself has taken, I guess, at least alluded to a kind of broader view of it, or like, well, you can regulate carry to some degree, but you have to, their view seems to be more that you have to let people have some way of carrying. And they seem more agnostic on the form of carry, whether it's open or concealed. But at the same time, the case that, Bruin was not about open carry. It was about concealed carry. And it's not clear that that's what the Supreme Court would rule in an open carry ban case, I don't think, at this point. But it is an interesting thing to see how, and maybe this will be a catalyst to get the issue in front of the court as well, to see, especially a place like the Ninth Circuit, which, that whole dynamic we discussed, if the Ninth Circuit, if this doesn't go to, although one of the things that is common in the Ninth Circuit, right, is you'll get a panel ruling that sides with gun rights activists, and then the court will take the case en banc. And I don't think they have ever ruled in favor of gun rights challenge en banc in the Ninth Circuit. So en banc, for anyone who doesn't know, although if you've listened all the way to this point of the podcast, you probably are well informed on these things, just means the full court will rehear the case. And so I would expect that's probably going to happen with this case as well. But I don't know, it'll be the whole thing is, I'll look forward to reading your analysis piece on this, because I would like to get a refresh on exactly what the Supreme Court said, and how not only this court interpreted it, but how the dissent and some of the other circuits that have looked at this have come to a different conclusion, right? That actually you can ban open carry as long as you have concealed carry available.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. And Reload members should check that out. Give it out, because I will lay out the thoughts, because like you said, other courts have definitely come on the other side of this question for sure. But beyond the Ninth Circuit's ruling, we have more NRA drama this week, because the NRA itself, the National Rifle Association of America, sort of the 501c4 entity that most people probably think of when they think of the NRA, has just filed a lawsuit against its foundation, the 501c3 charity arm of the NRA, accusing the charity of essentially engaging in a pattern of retribution or retaliation. The allegations state that the NRA Foundation board has been sort of packed with former, allies of former NRA CEO Wayne LaPierre, and are not happy with the fact that the main NRA's board has been replaced by a bunch of reformers who are trying to kind of take steps away from the NRA's recent troubled past. And in doing so, are essentially trying to be a shadow competing NRA organization rather than the traditional supportive role that the NRA Foundation has played in, contributing grant money and funding programs for the broader NRA. So more drama for the NRA and its beleaguered state.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people are maybe starting to think the NRA had finally gotten past its corruption scandal, right? Because LaPierre has been gone now for more than a year at this point. I think, or is it 2025 that he left? 2024.
24.
I think it's 24, right? Yeah. So it's almost 2 years now that LaPierre technically resigned, but he resigned ahead of the New York court finding that he had inappropriately diverted money toward personal expenses. Essentially, he was liable for millions of dollars in damages for mismanaging the NRA's money, essentially. Him and others, but obviously he was the primary center of that corruption scandal, and a lot of the people who enabled those actions were either resigned from the board or were not reelected by the members, and you had a whole reform movement that's been going on for years, but has finally really kind of captured control of the group. We had one of those reform board members on not that long ago, I think a couple months ago, Amanda Suffolk, to discuss the situation at the what is the membership organization, the 501c4. That's the National Rifle Association of America is the technical name. And then, but the reality is that some of those folks, some of those Wayne LaPierre allies who have been dismayed with the reformers and don't like the direction they're taking the group, they are on the board of the foundation, and the foundation is an integral part of how the NRA operates. Because a lot of these major political groups operate this way, where because of the way federal election financing laws work, you have to have several groups if you want to take full advantage of what you're able to do as far as activism goes. Excuse me. I mean, a lot of these coughs will probably get cut out, so sorry if I'm apologizing for something you don't actually hear in the audio, but I am just a little bit of a cough here. Anyway, so major political organizations tend to be made up of several different legal entities that are all working in cooperation. And so the NRA, I think, has 8 groups, if I'm remembering correctly. They have a couple of, they have the one C4, which is the main group that where when you buy a membership, you're buying a membership to the 501c4. That's the one that has millions of dues paying members, right? Even though it's shrunk over the years, they still have millions. And then they have like some political action committees where they can actually spend directly on giving money to candidates and things like that. Then they have special, super PACs where they can make independent expenditures on behalf of candidates. And then they have 501c3s. They have a couple of them, the biggest one being the foundation. And those groups can raise money, and they have to disclose their donors, but their donors get a tax benefit. They don't have to pay taxes on the donations, right? And their restriction in what they can do with that money, like they can't directly fund political campaigns, for instance, as a 501c3. They can't give to candidates, things of that nature. So but they can do a lot of other stuff that's non-political, like Eddie the Eagle, I think, is a program they fund at the NRA. That's one of the disputed programs here, right? Because the NRA is claiming that the foundation has not been giving the money they're supposed to be giving to support these programs that they've supported for years and years. And they're effectively like accusing them of copyright or trademark infringement, right? Because they're saying the money is being raised under the guise of the NRA, but it's not actually going to support NRA programs. That's the claim here, right?
Yeah, essentially the legal claim itself is like a trademark infringement case. That's how the NRA is hoping to advance its grievances here, because to your point, the accusation is that members donate or folks donate to the NRA Foundation, they're doing it under the assumption that that money is going to go to fund the NRA's programs. But if the NRA is engaged in this pattern of being vindictive or whatever the NRA is claiming here and not giving them that money, then in that case, it's a misuse of donor intent is what they're claiming. And then also, taking the NRA's trademarked IP essentially and branding yourself as the NRA without actually supporting the NRA with the money that is being given. So that's the claim. Anyway,
it's a big claim.
We'll I
mean, for the NRA to have to file suit against its own foundation is significant, and it's bad. Obviously, it's bad for the group. And they've also claimed that the board over there at the foundation has taken steps to remove themselves from accountability as well. They've made the board self-perpetuating, meaning that it's no longer chosen by like the NRA board member. So it's a big deal. There are big claims being made here. Now, you did reach out to the foundation, and they didn't respond immediately, but they did actually get back to you eventually. What do you have just a gist of what they've said?
Yeah, sure. So spokesperson Katie Rogers sent me a statement a couple of days after the piece went up. Very long statement, but essentially, so I'll give you just a couple pieces of it, some of the more relevant statement. She says, quote, "The foundation's trustees and leadership take their fiduciary obligations to the foundation seriously. Notwithstanding the NRA's allegations and actions over recent months, the foundation has continued to provide appropriate funding for qualifying C3 programs of the NRA and other organizations that are consistent with its charitable mission." So essentially rebutting the claim that the foundation is withholding money. This foundation has also worked to steadfastly strengthen internal controls and corporate governance, as well as continuing to require transparency and accountability from the NRA. So that's, I think, alluding to the allegations that the board is sort of isolating itself on the NRA Foundation side. They don't actually directly address those claims in the statement that I got from Rogers here, but that's the closest I was able to see. And then they said that litigation is unfortunate, but the foundation remains confident in the propriety of its governance, its stewardship of charitable assets, and the strength of its legal position. And so basically saying that they think they're on solid footing here and they plan to fight this lawsuit.
Yeah. I think that's the bottom line you get from that, is that they're disputing claims and that they're going to fight in court over this, which is not really the place the NRA needs to be after half a decade of previous court fights with New York State and others. I will say certainly that foundation has been much more active in promoting its other grants of late. We've gotten a lot of press releases where they talk about giving to programs like USA Shooting and other non-NRA affiliated, but still gun-related events. So this has been interesting to watch. They are acting more like a totally separate group, but we'll have to see what comes out in terms of evidence for how they're doing their grant making and how different that is from how they used to do it, or whether there's some sort of internal an attempt to attack the new NRA leadership using the foundation. We'll have to see what the evidence the NRA actually provides for those claims is, and what the counterclaims by the foundation are. But certainly the players are really the same here, from the internal struggle at the membership organization, where you had a lot of prominent board members and executives, former presidents like Charles Cotton and David Coy and others who were Wayne LaPierre allies, and have now left the NRA, the C4, the membership organization, and some of them have reconstituted on the foundation. So the sort of dividing lines are still the same basic people involved. Now it's moved to a new battleground, though, and it's a significant one. The foundation is a huge source of funding for the C4. It's going to be a big deal for the group moving forward, but we will continue to cover that one as well. And then I think just briefly here on a couple issues where we'll have links or maybe new stories as well. That some of that news of the last week or the last 24 hours I've really picked up is, one is the Maduro arrest or detention, whatever you want to call that, operation. But the result of it is that he was captured, he and his wife, and was captured, and now they've been charged in American, federal court in New York. And one of the things they've been charged with, which I don't know that people expected this to happen, because a lot of the claims against Maduro, some of which obviously predate Trump administration, but are mostly drug related. But as often is the case, drug related crimes can often be um, can involve firearms as well, obviously. And so one of the charges brought against Maduro is actually an NFA related charge, which is the possession in of an unregistered machine gun in furtherance of drug trafficking. And it's sort of a multiplier, like it adds time to the drug trafficking charge. One thing that the language of the indictment makes a little bit confusing is it seems as though he's being charged with personal possession of an unregistered machine gun, which would be a strange thing to charge, a leader of a foreign country with, because presumably he was never in the United States with a machine gun. But my understanding, and I've reached out to a number of experts, and I have a piece on this over the weekend, but most likely. But they, what I've been told is it's more of the aiding and abetting. It's like if he directed anyone else to use unregistered machine guns to carry out the drug trafficking operation, then that would satisfy the charge. Like that's more what they're trying to go after. And there are some, I hadn't heard of this kind of charge before personally, but it turns out that there is a recent example actually of this, and it was the ex-Honduras president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, who people may have heard of being extradited. I think he surrendered and was sent to the United States for prosecution for basically the same list of crimes. It sounds like they're just going with the same playbook, essentially, for how they're going to prosecute Maduro, making the same accusations. And that was also something that Hernandez was charged with and convicted of. Before, the weird thing about it is that President Trump had just pardoned Hernandez for these exact same crimes just recently, and so that makes the whole thing a little bit more jumbled. But that is, we're gonna have a piece that's more explains the ins and outs of this. It's not, they're not charging Maduro necessarily with like building his own machine gun in Nevada or something. They're not saying that he came into the U.S. with machine guns. They're saying he directed other people to drug traffic in the U.S. and to, as part of that, they used machine guns. And that's still something that I'm a little bit unclear on, is like what level of evidence they have to show. Like they have to specifically find an actual example of this happening and make that direct connection between the perpetrator and Maduro, or if it's something a little more generalized than that. So I have some emails out to experts who will hopefully help give us a little more insight into that question. And then we also had a pair of ICE stories. The first one is probably the one everybody's heard of, which was the shooting yesterday. And we'll have a video from the New York Times. Had the best, I think, analysis breakdown video that I've seen that just adds all of the different angles that are out there together. But for anyone who hasn't heard about it, an ICE officer, we don't know, has not been identified. He was wearing a mask, but he shot and killed a driver there in Minneapolis during an ICE operation. And obviously, there's a lot of controversy around this, as you could probably imagine, over the circumstances of this shooting. 3 shots fired. The driver does at least sideswipe this officer with her car. He does not appear to be injured during that, but it may certainly give plausible, justifiable explanation for his use of deadly force at that moment, although he takes several more shots, it appears, after being out of the way of the car. So it's definitely going to be one of those ones that's highly controversial. And we'll have it linked to the Times video analysis just so you can actually watch and understand it yourself. And there's I've discussed a little bit of my view on it on social media, but it's a little too early, I think, to write like a full breakdown or do a full. Maybe we'll do an episode down the line on it with someone as well. But obviously, that's hugely in the news and has some relation to what we do here, right? It's a shooting. It's not necessarily a gun rights question, but it's a sort of self-defense or law enforcement use of deadly force story. So that's significant. And then it also ties into the second story that you had a link in the newsletter for, Jake, earlier, that will be in the newsletter.
That's right. Yeah. Also, the New York Times reports on a new $100 million recruitment push that ICE is evidently going on, explicitly targeting gun rights supporters. Evidently, they're looking to help fill the ranks of the agency by going out to gun shows and other places with the Times dubs gun rights supporters and quote unquote military and law enforcement supporters, trying to basically bolster their ranks and looking explicitly at folks who support the Second Amendment to do so.
Yeah, well, there's just practically, there's certainly a lot of crossover between gun rights supporters and just people on the right politically. So, you're more, I would imagine, statistically at this point in America today, somebody who is likely to support expansive view of gun rights is also likely to support the more restrictive view of immigration, just because of the dynamics of the country, not necessarily because the two issues have an obvious ideological overlap. It's more the political parties and how they've aligned in the United States. But and then additionally, that's also probably why you don't. Certainly, that's not true of every gun rights supporter. I'm just talking on the average here, because and ICE is the way they've been conducting this recent incident aside, the operating with masks constantly, sort of anonymous policing, and even doing some pretty shocking stuff like literal black helicopter raids on an apartment that ended up not resulting in any criminal charges, despite claiming that there was like a den of gang activity. Those are things that a lot of gun rights activists have been upset about but there is the twist of like, these aren't aimed at enforcing gun laws. These tactics have been aimed at enforcing immigration laws. And so a lot of gun rights activists don't necessarily see the connection there. And so, it'll be interesting to see how well this sort of campaign actually works. They obviously have been given a ton of funding in the last bill to hire a lot more agents. So, but I think the reporting that I've seen is that they've been struggling to do that. So whether or not advertising at gun shows is going to help fill the gap, I don't know. But it's not it's not in a completely irrational place to do that, just because of the political makeup of people likely to be there. But anyway, we will certainly follow both of those stories as things move along. And I think we have one last final story, which is a bit of an interesting gambit from the New York governor.
Yeah, that's right. So the governor, Kathy Hochul, just gave her State of the State address, where she laid out, obviously, State of the State address, it covers a whole lot of ground, but in particular on guns, a new, like you said, gambit going after so-called ghost guns, which New York already restricts. But a new tact that she would like to pursue is making 3D printer manufacturers responsible, quote unquote, for restricting the ability to even use them to create guns. I'm not sure the mechanics, the feasibility of doing so, but evidently that is the planned strategy in New York. And the reason why, it's sort of a far-fetched idea in my mind, but the reason why I think it's still newsworthy is that in a state like New York, you could very well see something like that become law, frankly. So will this be the next frontier in going after homemade firearms? We'll have to see.
It reminds you a bit of the Biden administration's attempt to regulate unserialized frames and receivers, where you kind of get to a certain point where it's like, we're just going to regulate raw metal too. Like, and this is a similar idea of like, you're going to ban the knowledge of how to make firearms. Is that where we're going? Is that the attempt? Because yeah, I mean, what, you're gonna how are you going to restrict You're just going to ban all 3D printers? I guess. It just seems like, and this is something you've seen a lot of gun rights activists describe as a sort of slippery slope argument, and those are generally considered to be a logical fallacy until somebody actually does, try to go down this slope. And so, yeah, I mean, practicality wise, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but doesn't mean they won't try to do it. So, I mean, they ban like uh, bulletproof vests and things of that nature in New York, or at least heavily restricted who can own them. So maybe they'll do that with 3D printers. Maybe you have to get be a police officer to own a 3D printer or something. I don't know. Certainly we'll follow it if it develops into anything viable as far as legislation goes. And you're right, like it's New York, so what Kathy Hochul wants could absolutely become law there. It's not that she's necessarily going to get everything she wants, but Democrats have total control, and she's the Democratic governor and the leader of the state party. So, yeah, when she brings it up as a priority, it could be. It's certainly worth paying attention to, but definitely one that's strange credulity as far as what they're trying to accomplish here. But anyway, that's I think all we've got. Though we covered quite a lot. It's every time we come into this, I'm always like, we'll try to go through these quickly and keep it short, but it's always too much interesting stuff to talk about. So, and it's our first one back, so we'll try to get back into the swing of things and keep these a little shorter moving forward. But I should get back to the wedding planning, and I will let you go, Jake. Hope you've got good play. I mean, your Broncos are in the playoffs for the first time in a while, right?
As we were in last year, but this is our first time being the 1 seed since
first time
2015.
In a year. A year is a while.
Yeah,
but it's the first time where I think people believe you could actually go somewhere, right? In a while.
That's right. Yeah.
So
that's right.
That's pretty exciting. The Eagles, well, they should have gotten the number 2 seed, in my opinion, by actually trying against the Redskins, or whatever they call themselves now. But they didn't, so we don't. We have the number 3 seed. But I think the Eagles still have a pretty good shot. The NFC seems pretty weak, frankly. I don't know that there's any team that I'd be too terrified of. The only thing I'm scared of is the Eagles not figuring things out. That's been their real problem. But should be a fun weekend. I'll probably be super jet lagged for the game, but hopefully I can stay awake and watch it, because we're getting back on Saturday on a 9-hour flight that doesn't go back in time like my flight from Manila did last year, which is sad, but it does almost. Like, it's a 6-hour difference here and it's a 9-hour flight, so I'll still be ahead of when I took off, but not by much. So I'll be back in the time vortex of moving through time zones, but hopefully I won't be too dead on Sunday to enjoy the game. We'll see. Hopefully it goes well. We're playing the Niners, who it's another one of these NFC teams where you just never know who's going to show up week to week. But that's all we've got for you guys this week, and we will see you again real soon.